what researchers have found is not just the people that went through this atrocity, their children and their grandchildren, literally this trauma that the people went through was passed on like an epigenetic heirloom. Yes, it sounds science fiction, but it's very much science.
One of the things that orientates us and changes our priorities is trauma, and that's something you talk about in the book as well. The really fascinating thing that I've always been keen to ask somebody is about this idea of intergenerational trauma, which you've referenced a second ago. Because I wasn't sure if intergenerational trauma was just like woo-woo spiritual stuff, or whether it was real science, i.e. that the idea that your parents' trauma can be passed on to you somehow. Is that true?
Yeah. Well, and yes, it is true. It is true. It's what researchers are really exploring, of how it's expressed in our descendants. And then we all have trauma just in our own life, right? And these are things that we can accumulate, and through things like therapy and somatic experiences and things like EMDR that I talk about, you can work on your trauma in your life. But for some of us, part of our trauma in our life today has to do with the trauma that our ancestors have gone through. So two geopolitical, historical things that were big things in our world were explored in the scientific literature to see how this plays out. One was a Ukrainian genocide, man-made famine in the early 20th century. Joseph Stalin, the Ukrainian people wanted to have freedom. Really, nothing new is under the sun. Every time the Ukrainian people wanted to have freedom, there was some sort of authoritarian squash on their efforts. But this famine in the early 1900s was done on the Ukrainian people. Millions of people died. And what researchers have found is not just the people that went through this atrocity, their children and their grandchildren had the same methylation gene variants. Methylation is something that we quantify on labs. It's a sort of interconnected different biochemical pathways that impact inflammation levels, impact neurotransmitters and how our brain works, different detoxification pathways, that literally this trauma that the people went through during this Ukrainian genocide was passed on like an epigenetic heirloom of how genes were expressed by their experience. Similar research was done in the Holocaust and the descendants of people that went through the Holocaust in Germany and Poland. So yes, it sounds science fiction, but intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma, looking at how trauma is literally stored in the cells and then passed on through family lines, is very much science. And it's shown that these people have increased likelihood of mental health issues, autoimmune issues, type 2 diabetes, different hormonal problems. And this is what's being explored in the science, but I could only imagine that it exists on a spectrum, that maybe all of our descendants haven't gone through the same things. But I think intuitively, again, we can know that there's certain behaviors and certain ways that people live in part because of what our ancestors have gone through.